You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is Thursday, October 3rd at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I talked last time about dismissing people or avoiding people and how with exploration, sometimes their thoughts about exploration are really organized around auto-regulating and distracting themselves from the lack of interaction with other people. And so I thought that I would talk this week about the way that preoccupied people enter into the process of exploration and how that looks for them. Dismissing people or avoiding people do have the capacity to explore, but they tend to orient themselves around secondary exploration, the gathering of time, energy, and resources. Preoccupied people, because they've had so much interference in the natural development of their capacity to explore, and because they're dependent on external regulation to feel emotionally settled, they tend to swap exploration for proximity, so that a lot of the strategies that they have are organized around maintaining proximity to somebody who's regulating for them. And one of the tricks of that process is to assume that the meaningfulness of life will come from that relational connection and not from independent exploration. That's really the purpose of which is to discover the meaningfulness of life. And this can work really well in different settings. We tend to talk about preoccupation as taking two distinct paths. One is a presentation of helplessness, and the other is a presentation of control or controlling a behavior. And sometimes there's a swap that can go on. But we really need to be able to manage our emotional regulation in order to separate, to pursue a primary exploration. And if we can't manage that emotional regulation, it really is very impactful in the way that we're able to explore. Christian?
This sort of dichotomy that you presented of control or flipping into helplessness, do those serve the same purpose for the person like using that strategy? I know it's not like a conscious strategy necessarily.
So the controlling behavior tends to emerge in mid-childhood, say around 6 or 7, when there's a additional brain development that would allow a child to be able to begin to take on the role. And it's usually in response to the caregiver's presentation as helpless. So in order for the child to manage the caregiver and create the perception that there's an adult managing the household so that they can get the things that they need from the adult world, they begin to take on a kind of controlling relationship with the caregiver to get them to manage the household. That's where it really comes from. If the caregiver is in charge, of course, and they have the adult level of control that they have, then the child is free to be helpless in a way of eliciting care. Remember, the child is attempting to elicit the care from the caregiver in the family system that they grow up in. And if the caregiver needs the child to appear to be helpless in order for the caregiver to feel a sense of satisfaction in their caregiving, then the child will produce the sense of helplessness in order to get the proximity and care from the caregiver. Is that making sense?
So it sounds like maybe there's a little bit of a different goal for each of the behaviors, like the helplessness grants closeness for the child, and the controlling actually like sort of puts things in order, or like uses the caregiver for a different, for like
They're
a
both attempts to elicit care.
okay.
Just depends on how the caregiver is presenting. So the child has a choice of what to do. For instance, if the child needs a slip sign for school, then they demand of the caregiver that they sign it rather than the caregiver volunteering to sign it. And they keep track of those things. If the child needs to have supplies, or if the child needs to have food in the house, or if the child wants to have dinner on time, often they end up taking over the preparing of the meal, for instance, whatever it is that they need to do, doing the laundry, or whatever it is. Oftentimes they'll go into school and they'll perform at a high level because that actually attracts attention to them that they have a hard time getting from somewhere else. But understand that the directedness of that is not for primary exploration. They're eliciting proximity and care through that presentation. That making sense? So when we talk about this, in some sense, the non-mentalizing modes of pretend mode, one of the things about preoccupation is it puts you in a position to pretend to be who it is that you think you need to be in order to elicit the care that you because you don't really develop monitoring. If you look at that pattern of preoccupation and how that develops, you're very spontaneous as a preoccupied person, and you're very oriented toward the other, and your mind easily enmeshes with the mind states of the other person. You're very externally oriented in the world and not so much in touch with what goes on with you. And you're very emotionally oriented and not particularly cognitively oriented, which means you don't monitor what presentation you have to do. You just keep throwing things up, hoping that one of them will be the right one so that people grab onto it and you get the care that you need. And the reason that you do that is because the caregivers are chaotic and they don't consistently respond to you. So there's no point in learning how to elicit care from a chaotic caregiver because they don't respond the same way. So there's no point in putting energy into developing the capacity to track it. Does that make sense? And so you're really just in the moment throwing up a presentation and seeing how it does. And if it doesn't do what you want, you throw up something else and see if that does. And eventually you land on something that elicits the care that you want. But you don't really have a sense of what's authentically yours, and you don't develop a ready dialogue with somebody else that's collaborative and a fair exchange. That makes sense. Mudit?
Hi, George. So the attention is different from the care, right, in this case?
Well, proximity, remember that we're dependent on our caregivers for emotional regulation in childhood. And so proximity to the caregiver that's available to us enough and their time, interest, and attention to help us emotionally regulate. With somebody who grows up to be disorganized, they don't really have a caregiver who has the capacity for that. And so what they need is to navigate the proximity mainly, in hopes that the proximity itself will be regulating them. Is that making sense? So if you look at that development, we all start out as auto-regulators, and we're all self-involved and regulating. And then, 3 months, 5 months into life, if we have a caregiver who comes reliably enough, we reorient toward external care. But if the caregiver provides that in an unpredictable way, we zoom in and enmesh with their mind state, and we operate as if the mind state and the emotional state of the caregiver is the primary emotional experience, and our own emotional experience begins to drift into the background, where we don't really attend to it so much. So that if we want to feel regulated in proximity to our caregivers, we have to regulate them. And that's where either the control or the helpless comes in. So we can navigate regulating them because the empathetic experience of the caregiver has displaced our own awareness of our own emotional states. And if they're well regulated because that's our dominant experience, we feel regulated. But it also means we can't separate from them because as soon as we do, we're outside of the empathetic experience of regulation and into our own emotional state, which is often quite dysregulated. Is that making sense? Go ahead.
Also, it's a form of caregiving in some sense.
Yes, it's role reversing. The child is put in charge of the care of the caregiver instead of the other way around.
But even in adult relationships, it would be the same, right?
Well, in adult relationships, caregivers, the caregiving is supposed to be in a secure dynamic, mutual, right? You take care of somebody else the way that they need, and they take care of you in the way that you need. But because preoccupied adults grow up in a family system where that doesn't really happen, they don't have the conditioning to understand those conditions. What they've always known is that they had to take care of the other person, and that the other person did not often reciprocate that. But as long as they did a good job at taking care of the other person, because the empathetic experience is the dominant emotional experience and the regulated mind state of the other person is the dominant experience, as long as they were doing okay, you felt good as long as you were in proximity to them. Is that making sense? So it is not the child who is secure or the child who is dismissing that is clinging to the banister and not wanting to go to school. It is the preoccupied child who can't regulate outside of proximity to the caregiver that doesn't want to leave. They don't want to leave because they're going to have a harder time regulating themselves, but they also don't want to have to come back to an adult who's completely dysregulated and then have to figure out how to bring them back into balance. Is that making sense? So who do you hook up with if you're used to taking care of somebody else and you don't demand from them that they reciprocate the care? You hook up with somebody who likes to be taken care of but doesn't think to reciprocate it. And the reason that you do that is because you can tolerate that relational condition when most people can't. And so you have the opportunity for connection there that other people wouldn't accept, really. That makes sense. But you do have to be able to show up well enough that the other person feels taken care of. And you have to be willing to do it without reciprocation. So what you find in preoccupied people is they're often burning out in terms of providing so much care without it being reciprocated so much. Yes, taking care of an addict parent or an addict partner. Addiction is a little bit different. Most people who are addicted are disorganized. And so one of the impediments to an organized, preoccupied person having a relationship with a disorganized person is that disorganized people self-isolate to emotionally regulated. That is counterproductive for the proximity seeking of the preoccupied person. So there's less of that than you might think. It's mostly organized dismissing people with organized preoccupied people, and that can create a fairly stable union where the dismissing person is taken care of by the preoccupied person, but the dismissing person does not reciprocate care particularly. It's transactional, and they're good with stuff, dismissing people, but they're not good with intimate emotional care. That makes sense. Now, understand that somebody who grows up in a and to be a preoccupied adult is not growing up in a collaborative, intimate environment, so they don't know that either. What they know is a transactional relationship. I do this for you, and then you reciprocate the things that I need. But it's not an emotional, collaborative, intimate experience. It's an exchange. Is that making sense? So, what you'll notice is that dismissing people are really good at secondary exploration and the gathering of stuff that they need in order to transact, and preoccupied people are really good at supporting somebody else's exploration. So you also have that match in terms of how exploration goes. Preoccupied people are often in a state of dissatisfaction because proximity to somebody else and an emotional regulation is also not primary exploration, not even really secondary exploration. And so there's a dissatisfaction that comes from a lack of exploration, which the preoccupied person demands of the dismissing person that they fulfill that, which the dismissing person, ironically, I like to say, interprets it as they have to work for more stuff, which is useful to them, right? That's one of the ways that preoccupied people support dismissing people, is by demanding that the dismissing person do better. And in that demand, they have more energy than to compete in the way that they like to. But it still doesn't provide for the preoccupied person, particularly a sense of meaningfulness. And relationships, even functional transactional relationships that are stable and last a long time, don't provide that meaning. And it isn't that the person is withholding that, it's that relationships aren't really for that. That's not what happens. A primary exploration is where the activity itself provides a sense of meaningfulness in your life. And secondary exploration is where you're gathering the resources in order to support your primary exploration. So what is it that you need to find out about, as Mary Oliver would say, your one wild and precious life? What do you need to know about it so that it feels fulfilling, it feels meaningful to you? You like to get up out of bed and go do it because it's enriching. Now, you're noticing that I'm giving you a handful of superlatives, but no no actual instructions for an activity to choose. And that is because you can derive meaning from a lot of different things depending on your conditioning. Kayleen, did you have a question?
No, I was just clearing my throat. Sorry.
You unmuted yourself. That's why I asked. As it turns out, since this is actually a meditation community, one of the things that people find really meaningful is the spiritual pursuits. You know, the quest for enlightenment actually is something that is very meaningful for a lot of people. And it really does produce this rich experience about being alive. And it opens up so much, takes you out of that very contractive, limited identification with the sense of self, and opens up this vast, cosmic, sacred way of navigating the world, which is fantastic. And so I think that that's probably a useful pursuit, but there are certainly others that also come in. But I might also say that a primary exploration is the authentic expression of what matters to you in a way that's communicative to other people, so that it's also an exchange. You go out and find out the things that really matter to you, and then you come back and you express them in an authentic way to that small group of people that you've gathered around you that are interested in you and what you find out. And you express that in an authentic way that's open and vulnerable, and then they also do that for you. They express to you the things that they've found out about this human condition that we're in, and that richness of exchange is the thing that fosters intimacy. You really know somebody based on the things that matter to them, and they really know you based on the things that matter to you, that are of interest to you. Is that making sense? Christian?
George, hopefully I can formulate this clearly. Could you comment on maybe this is just a particular way of understanding Buddhist philosophy, and maybe it's not true, but that maybe there's kind of a tension between finding meaning out in the world, out in the like the material world, versus a spiritual practice where you let go of attachments and you kind of see the emptiness and phenomena. Are those kind of not pointing in maybe different directions somewhat?
Well, we have the difficulty of the word attachment and non-attachment
Sure.
in the attachment theory sense and in the Buddhist sense, and what it actually means. So non-attachment means that you don't, in the Theravada sense, of course, depending on what tradition you're in and how it's taught. Also, we're in a word salad trap, but
I guess I meant attachment, not in the attachment theory sense.
so I would say that non-attachment means that you can fixate your meaning to the sensing experience that you are having, and that you can be non-attached to it, so that you're free to attach and non-attach to the sensing experience, so that you have the capacity to sense, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. You have mind, which does this highly selective curation of the sense mind moments that you're gathering. You put those sense moments, those mind moments together, you associate meaning to them, and as soon as you associate the meaning, they fixate. That is to say, you attach meaning to the sensing experience, and it rolls into a tableau of conceptual reality, which you project out into the world, and that's what you're inhabiting. But if you recognize that you've misidentified or misassigned meaning, you're free to simply drop that and reassign it. That would be what I would think of as attachment and non-attachment. And in each moment as it ends, you don't cling to it because it's something that you wanted. In each moment it arises, and you're not aversive to what is arising in the moment, and that you're coming and going from this sensing experience into reality. So ultimate reality into conceptual reality. And there's total freedom, and there's no clinging, there's no grasping, there's no grab in anything, as Dan would say. Which is not to say that you can't fixate anything, which is equally problematic, right? It's the coming and going that is a representation of freedom, not either the clinging or the inability to cling.
Okay. So I guess you're saying that you don't think a spiritual or Buddhist practice will necessarily contradict your wanting to like find meaning out in the world in kind of more material ways, or that a practice doesn't kind of dull that. I don't know if that's kind of a nihilistic view.
I don't think that the collection of material things provides a lot of meaning. How long does new car smell last?
I guess maybe
You
even
get the first scratch, and then it's a total loss.
I guess maybe I'm being imprecise. Maybe just achievements or attainments, things that could be
Cultural tokens. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like if I want to be an artist, then some artistic success.
Well, so that's the cultural idea of we. If you read the newspaper about art, mostly what they're talking about is how much it sold for, not what the content of it was, not what the meaning of it. Sometimes if you read reviews of shows of artists, you can have that, but our culture is so confined and media is so constrained, and with the advent of AI, it's just going to be stripped down to a kind of propagandistic message that supports people in power. That the that is probably unlikely to provide the kind of meaning as an artist that you would be looking for, which is, of course, in the discovery of the making of the work. That is what is the meaningful part of it. Does it matter that your auction price on the secondary market is spectacular because you don't make any of that? What does it really matter? Which is coming back to this idea of the authentic expression of yourself. And in our culture, of course, in art in particular, branded artists do better than experimental artists. So you make a painting and it sells well, and you make another version of the painting and it sells well. And then all of a sudden, you've made 200 versions of the same painting. Or if you're Warhol, 900 versions of the flower painting, because it was a popular painting. Is that then primary exploration, or does that somehow morph into secondary exploration, which is really the gathering of cultural tokens, which I don't think is the meaning that we're really talking about.
Okay.
We did?
Just a quick vocabulary clarity on the definition of helplessness. I know the Christian's comment of "tell me what to do." He just wrote, "Is that considered?" Would he define that as helplessness?
Well, helplessness is a presentation. It's not an actual lack of ability. It's a mode of seeking proximity. So to be helpless, you would scan the environment and look for a problem, and then you would present the problem to somebody so that they could solve it for you. But it's usually not the problem that matters to you, particularly whether it's solved or not. It's that you get the proximity in the request for the problem to be solved. So the more unsolvable the problem, the better it is for you. Because then the other person doesn't have a chance to solve it and they have to engage in it. And so what I would describe as a helpless loop is you look in the environment, identify a problem, you present it to somebody, they offer you a solution which you reject and then represent the problem. They offer you another solution which you reject and represent the problem. They offer you another solution and you reject it and represent the problem. And what you'll notice in the person who's trying to solve the pretend problem for somebody is that you're gradually feeling more and more helpless to help because they've already tried everything and nothing has worked. So that's really what the helplessness is. The person themselves is not helpless. And most of the time, they actually don't need you to solve the problem that they're presenting, because it's not about the problem, it's about the proximity. It's a pretend mode request for proximity, which they don't make directly. Is that making sense?
So the mind state is not actually helpless. It's just a pretension of,
Right.
wow.
They're
Okay.
not helpless. And generally, they could solve the problem themselves. I'll give you an example. When I was working in the rehab, one of the students at the rehab came up to me and she said, "I'm so glad I saw you. You're the perfect person to help me with this." And it's really terrible. My whole family is concerned about that. And I said, "What's the problem?" And she said, "We can't get a visa for my grandmother to come from a country." And I thought to myself, I'm a meditation teacher. I know nothing about immigration. I know nothing about the law. I'm the last person that you would ask to solve a visa problem. And yet it was presented as a way of me being the perfect person to help with this, right? So you see the conundrum of it. So how do you get out of a helpless loop? I can actually tell you how to do that. You just say, "Oh my God, that's a terrible problem. What are you going to do?" And then they have to solve it. Or you sometimes, when it seems like they've already solved it, you can say, "Oh, that was a terrible problem. What did you do?" And then they'll just tell you what they did to solve the problem. Is that making sense? When we look at preoccupation, and particularly when we put it into, say, a work context, because preoccupied people don't explore well, they make very good support people for somebody who does explore. So you'll notice the upper echelon of the hierarchical structure of these teams is somebody who can explore and somebody who has an idea of what the exploration could be. And then the next layer down, or the next couple of layers down, are more preoccupied people who are very good at helping to manifest somebody else's exploration because they don't have to come up with the direction themselves. Is that making sense? You know the Peter principle, where you're promoted one level above what you can actually do. You can't promote a preoccupied person into a position of exploring because they don't really know how to do it. So they are better in that supporting position than they are in the direction position. But they can be quite excellent in that position. But if you were a preoccupied person, that would continue to lead to the deprivation of not engaging in your own exploration. It's not satisfying ultimately to support somebody else's exploration. We really do have to figure out how to do this for ourselves. And when you look at the core of the difficulty for the preoccupied person, it's the dependence on external emotional regulation. It's the dependence on proximity to a regulator that keeps them confined and unable to explore independently. And so the first part of this process is beginning to develop the capacity to emotionally regulate yourself independent of proximity to a regulator, so that you have the space to begin the journey of exploration. The other, I think of it as a bummer in terms of the nature of these things, is you're all the way into adulthood, and the restrictions on your early exploration have left your capacity to explore without resilience. And one of the other things about people who are good at exploring is the capacity for resilience. And when you really begin to understand the nature of exploration, what you know is that most of the avenues of exploration that you pursued are fruitless. What does that mean? It means that the depth of meaning that you were looking for in that avenue of inquiry that you engaged in does not produce the meaning that you want. And if you're a seasoned explorer, you understand that, and it's always been like that, and you just take it into the process of exploring, and you gather the information that you need to know from that avenue and shift into another avenue of exploration. Because when you do find that depth of meaning, it's so rewarding. It makes total sense that you would do that. But when you're just starting out and you two or three of these avenues don't pan out and you don't have resilience, it can be quite defeating. And so you stop exploring until the quality of the deprivation becomes so great you can't bear that anymore. And then you begin another foray into exploration. And if two or three of the avenues don't pan out, again, it's too disappointing and you withdraw from the exploration. So part of this is a cognitive understanding of the nature of exploration, and that most of the time it doesn't pan out, but that's actually easy to just then move on from, rather than stopping. That making sense? And in order to take the level of risk that you need to take to really find out the things that you need to know, you need a safety net. We're talking some high wire stuff here. Are you free to get onto the high wire and to dance, but with no safety net, and then plunge to your death on the cold ground is inhibiting, right? Whereas if you have a safety net and it doesn't matter whether you fall off the high wire, you can take some extraordinary risks for meaning. And what is the safety net? So what you need to begin to develop is this intimate collection of people around you who will catch you emotionally when you fall, which means you're going to have to come out of pretend mode and begin to tell people who you really are, which means you're going to have to develop the capacity to know that, which means you're going to have to come into a higher level of mentalizing than what you might be used to. Is that all making sense? All of this is doable. I think one of the things that really is important to understand is all of these skills that you need to be able to do all of this, you can learn, and you can learn it in a basic meditation practice. You don't need some miraculous solution. Would it?
How long do you think, I mean, you work with a lot of students, how long do you think it's worth exploring one thing? Because I think I also have some sort of black and white thinking when I start something and there has to be meaning. Almost like I'm expecting this feeling of meaning coming in the second session.
Right. So, in some sense, it's the fostering of curiosity. One of the ways that it's often characterized as peak moments, I think, is one of the cultural ideas about this. What I think is that really the orientation is toward doing your very best in everything, in every moment, doing the best that you can do, which creates a sense of meaningfulness in the ordinary stuff. The reason for that is so much of life is ordinary. So much of life is repetitious. We have day-long cycles that the older you get, of course, the shorter they are in terms of a percentage of the whole, just mathematically, but also the experience of the repetition of them. How do you then make all of the stuff meaningful, all of the little stuff meaningful, deriving some little bit of meaning on it that then supports the current of examining things for meaning, so that when you do stumble into something that has the potential for huge insight, that you're able to take it. Is that making sense? And it's not a disregard for things that don't immediately have that intoxicating quality to them, and only pursuing the ones that are the very intense experiences. So that in some sense, there's an equanimity to the process, and then ease, a non-attachment, as Christian was alluding to. We can attach easily to these peak moments, and in some sense then devalues everything else. Although there's a little bit of meaning that can be skimmed off pretty much everything that you engage. Every moment. Every moment, well, when you think about it, every moment in the human condition is a stunning event. Even though sometimes it's repetitious. I think the quality of sacredness is in every moment. Can you identify that and allow the experience of that? Can you see it rushing by at the extraordinary pace it goes? Sometimes Shinzen used to talk about it as bodhicitta. The heart breaks open, and then you become more oriented to people. You become more oriented to the exchange with other people. And I know that in childhoods that produce adverse attachment conditioning, we don't really see other people as this extraordinary benefit to us. In fact, sometimes we have a reluctance to be in relationship to other people because our experience of other people, and I'm not in any way challenging your perception of this. You're correct. They weren't reliable. They didn't provide well. It wasn't worth it. That doesn't mean all people are like that. That's one of those cognitive pieces. And in order to explore deeply, you have to be able to connect to people who will support you, because you can't make it. You can't take the level of risk that you need to if you have no support, because if it goes badly, you won't be able to re-regulate yourself. And the periods of dysregulation will be too long and too interruptive. Is that making sense? So with preoccupied people, which maybe I'll wrap this up and then we can do a little bit of practice. What needs to happen is you need to improve your mentalizing enough, which is done through practice, that you can begin to emotionally regulate yourself and begin to really see clearly the mind state of the other and your own mind state. And each time you notice that whole of the enmeshing mind into the other's mind state, you turn your attention back in to your own emotional state, so that you swap out your own emotional states as the primary experience from the empathetic experience of the other, which has been flipped by the requirement of the caregiver that involved you in their mind states. And then begin to tolerate the lack of experience of exploring that you have. Sometimes a sense of humor about it is good, and sometimes getting people to help you in a way that fosters you and is for the purpose of exploration, and not the helplessness that is really about proximity. So you're really moving in the direction of exploring, and then begin to discern simply what means more to you from your engagement in something, and directing yourself more and more in the direction of meaning, so that you have the agency to fulfill your own life without being dependent on a vicarious relationship to somebody else's exploration. Is that making sense? Viva.
Hi.
Thank you for this. I've been wanting to join for a while, but haven't been available at this time of day. I just have a curiosity. I grew up in a very like conservative, highly like gendered society in terms of conventional gender roles, and I'm curious if there's any sort of distribution of a gendered distribution when it comes to these different types of attachment.
Well, because preoccupied people mainly form relationships with dismissing people, they're the same number of
Okay.
so if you look at it's more likely that class has an effect on attachment than it is gender. That if you grow up in a resourced community, it has a very different effect than if you grow up in a non-resourced community. But let's say 20% of people are dismissing and 20% of people are preoccupied, and there's an even distribution across the sexes. Mainly what you're looking at is you have an 85% chance of developing the same attachment strategy as your primary caregiver, which means if your mother is dismissing, it doesn't matter what sex you are, you'll develop that strategy, right? So in your household, if you had a preoccupied mother and you grew up to be preoccupied, which is the stereotypical role of a female in our culture, but you had a brother, they would also be preoccupied.
I see. So what causes that stereotype? Like, or what contributes to it?
Power and the distribution of resources, and mainly in the West, it's about property and heredity that I think that creates these stereotypes. There is some biological difference between men and women, or males and females. You know, if you separate gender from sex, there's biological imperatives that are associated, but it isn't so much around ability or around gender identity. If you look at I'm referencing John Money from John Hopkins when I talk about this, and I haven't really found something that I like better than that. But you have in the development of the sexes chromosomal sex. Sorry if this is too granular, but
No, so it's very interesting to me. Thank you.
So XY and XX, there's a hormonal change. So depending on whether you have a normal range of hormonal receptivity, it will change the characteristics of the physical body. But you also have a brain. All zygotes are female. Okay? So everybody starts with a female-oriented brain. And there's a process of hormonalization of the brain where if you have XY and you're going to develop into a male, the brain is first defeminized and then masculinized. But in let's say your mother took barbiturates while you were in the third trimester, and that interfered with the masculinization or the feminization of the brain. You would be born in the genetic sex body, but you would have a different orientation brain-wise than you might. Then you're born and you grow up in a family system, and depending on the gender role acceptance in the family system, you would learn to be the gender role that is assigned to you in your family system, which would hold for most people throughout childhood until puberty. And then when puberty happens, you have the cognitive ability to then make a gender assignment for yourself, which is one of the things that happens in adolescence now. A lot of the time it's because there's a greater flexibility in gender roles, and there's a natural experimentation that happens in that post-puberty adolescent phase of trying to understand what identity you might like to have. And if you had the freedom to explore it, then you could manifest a lot of different versions and then settle into one. But there's also an arbitrary quality to the assignment of capacities based on male and female. For instance, I think largely the men's movement, as we see it now, are preoccupied men who identify that as feminine and want to be dismissing because that's been identified as masculine.
Yeah.
And it's unbearable when you lock yourself into these rigid identities that are based on cultural and not based on either the family system or the biology of what's really true.
So these stereotypes also create certain pressures.
Right, to conform. And if you're not good at conforming, of course, it creates the perception that you're not lovable in childhood, of course. And then it also creates the perception that your authentic expression is not acceptable. Then you begin to hide your authentic expression. And the more you hide your authentic expression, the greater the experience of deprivation is, because you're never really expressing who you are. And that's never being satisfied. And who you are expressing is not who you are. And even if that is satisfied, it's not satisfying. That making sense.
Yeah.
And then we also have the heteronormative thing where if you identify as female, it trumps biological sex. And if you identify as male, it trumps biological sex, which is to great advantage to the male population and great disadvantage to the female population. But it's already extremely disadvantaged to the female population. So why would that bother men, really? That makes sense.
Okay. There's so many more questions that just came up from you saying what you said, but I'll stay with the curiosity. Thank you.
I'm a big proponent of androgyny. That that you should have a whole spectrum to choose from, and choose whatever feels as a representation of an authentic expression of yourself.
Right. Yeah. I grew up in one very particular, very gendered and stereotypical society, and now I live in North America, and my tween age child is non-binary. So I'm definitely like aware of the spectrum. But I think that I was noticing as you were talking, particularly about preoccupied, and I've noticed this also in other things I've listened to you say, that as I'm listening, my mind will come up with examples that I'm familiar with from my day-to-day life, and they're often female people, or it's gendered in that sense. And so I was wondering if that was due to the stereotype and pressures that our society puts on gender, or if it's just like what I see, if I'm my own. But I was just curious to hear what you had to say about it. So thank you for that.
Shall we do a little practice? Okay. Let go of the meditation. How's that?
Thank you, George. The sense of self, when that arises, it's very clear to me every time. But it just takes the whole space. The mind, it's almost like it would just draw so much attention to it, and they would stay there. Maybe part of me doesn't want that.
Well, it has a lot of grab. I'm doing this. I'm in charge of this. I'm the author of this. I'm the controller of this. Compelling. So then the question is, if you restrict the focus to a narrower and narrow portion of each of the sense gates, in order to have the self-experience, it's a fairly broad focus. You zoom in on one of the sense gates, it's going to be hard to manifest the sense of self in that space. And you would do the self-inquiry, where in visual experience is the self? You can't find it. Where in auditory experience is the self, and you can't find it. Then you pop open to internal thinking and the body, emotion and the corporal part of it, and that's the self.
Fantastic.
And it's meant for comic relief mostly. The great organizing principle of all things, the self, in our limited experience.
Although it does look outside the scope of see, hear, feel for me, it's almost like it's a fourth thing.
Right. See, hear, feel. It's usually internal visual thinking, internal auditory thinking, emotion, and the physical quality of the body is what creates the perception of self.
Feels like something else.
What's that?
I don't know how to describe it.
It's the synthesis of that space.
Mm-hmm. There is a feel out in there.
Yeah, definitely. Bye. Christian.
I was doing a whole great litigation in my head, so I was bouncing between hear and feel. But I found I'd get really lost in the thread of my argumentation, and like it'd be hard for me to like keep the noting of hear and actually keep the argument going, which maybe I don't need to keep the argument going, but I just noticed that was kind of a hard thing to both track and kind of stay in the hear space.
If we talk about it from the mentalizing perspective, you're slipping into the spontaneous side and losing the monitoring side. So you want to tighten up the brain, tighten up the experience, and monitor harder so you don't get swept up into the spontaneity.
Yeah, it seemed like when I could get back to the noting and kind of tighten up, I would lose that thread, which
Yes,
because it's a lot of ruminating, but
that's the balance, right? If you over tighten, of course, the spontaneity goes away, and so the flow of the internal chatter is interfered with.
yeah.
So there's a balance that was absent.
I guess I've noticed in my meditating, maintaining that balance in here space seems to be kind of the most difficult one for me.
Right. More to do. Everyone okay? So really the only thing we have left coming up this year, since everything's already started and is chugging along, is the exploration half day that's at the end of the month. And we're really going to focus on advanced mentalizing is how I like to talk it. In the preliminary classes, we really focus on basic mentalizing, which is the development of just a way of relating, and all the way up to meaning making as something that you can mentalize. And we talked in the last exploration workshop on the intermediate set of mentalizing. And so in this workshop, we're really going to focus on the advanced set, which is really what you need to go into deep practice, but also in a way of reflecting on your own authentic expression and what that actually means and how you assign meaning to things and how it's represented. All of those things are in that advanced set. So we'll talk about that. And then I was also going to talk about how that expression in over the course of a lifetime of exploring, how that represents in the youthful explorations of my 20s and later 40s and 50s, and then what's happening now. You'll see, I think, how that that capacity to explore, but also the lack of the more there is a lack of interference with the authentic expression, how it represents itself differently in a visual expression of that. So that's the idea of it. Anyway, take a look at that. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're a resource and you can make a donation, that you will. It helps support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. There's a link on the website to do that. Really appreciate your practice. Thanks for being here. We will see you soon, I hope, somewhere. Bye.